Oh, okay.
Someone did
So
it.
Okay. So just so everyone knows, this session is being recorded. Okay. So back to the project, and thank you, Ian, for reminding me of that. So the objective of the project is to examine funder-publisher policy alignment and provide recommendations on how to improve alignment. The rationale for this is really that funder and publisher policies influence and motivate data sharing by researchers. We believe there's a need for policy alignment in order for research data policies to be maximally effective. So alignment between funders, between publishers, and between funders and publishers. And yet, as far as we can tell, comparatively little work has been done to examine funder-publisher policy alignment. So a bit of a history of discussions on this project within RDA. We brought the project proposal to RDA Plenary 16, where it was validated by attendees. The project essentially consists in 3 phases. The first phase is a research and analysis phase, where we're conducting research into funder-publisher policy alignment, specifically related to data availability statements, DMPs, and funders and publishers encouraging or requiring the use of specific repositories. Phase 2 of the project is developing recommendations to improve policy alignment. So as part of that phase, we'll be engaging stakeholders to discuss the current state of policy alignment and develop recommendations on how to improve alignment. The plan is for these recommendations to be developed through a process, an iterative process of community input and review. Finally, phase 3 is the application of the recommendations. So as part of this phase, we will disseminate the recommendations and explore approaches to implementation, for example, pilot projects, and consider how the recommendations could be used as a basis for continued policy alignment. So following validation of the project at Plenary 16, we came back and held a joint session at Plenary 17, where we updated participants on phase 1 research findings to date and discussed possible activities and stakeholders to engage as part of the project. That discussion produced 3 key takeaways. The first was that while the deliverables of the project are sound, the rationale for the project and the current status of policy alignment and misalignment and the evidence base supporting the project could be stronger. The second key takeaway was that the evidence base could reveal additional policy features to consider, for example, beyond data availability statements, DMPs, and preferred repository. And the third takeaway was that the project should engage other stakeholders for their input on the issue. So as a result, we've really framed this session in light of those takeaways. So the overarching objective for this session will be to improve our understanding of policy alignment and misalignment, and to explore which policy features we should investigate with stakeholder input before advancing the project further. And to do this, we will hear perspectives on data policy challenges, benefits, and drivers. We'll provide an update on findings from some policy research work that the STM Association has been leading. And finally, we'll discuss with participants how to incorporate all of the insights into the project. For example, policy features to address, perhaps even the nature of the recommendations we could develop, and so on. And with that, I'd like to turn to our first speaker to discuss, the broad rationale for funder-publisher policy alignment. I'll stop sharing my screen and let Katrina pull hers up. And as she does that, I'll provide a bit of an introduction to her. So Katrina McCallum is Director of Open Science at Hindawi Limited. She has 21 years experience in scholarly publishing, including 17 years in open access publishing. She joined PLOS from Elsevier in 2003 to launch PLOS Biology as one of the senior editors, leaving as advocacy director in 2017. She is a member of the OASPA Board of Directors, the Advisory Board of the Royal Society Publishing, and Dryad. She is also on the steering committee of DORA. She is a founding individual of the I4OC Initiative for Open Citations and the I4OA Open Abstracts campaigns. She was also a member of the European Commission's Open Science Policy Forum, or Policy Platform rather, from 2017 to 2020. She has a PhD in population genetics from Edinburgh University. So with that, I'm happy to pass it over to Katrina.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to start my stopwatch. Thanks very much, Jeremy, and all the other organizers for inviting me to come and speak. I'm going to present more of a bigger picture. I've got too many slides as usual, but I know this is a very educated audience, so I'm going to speak to the slides rather than read the slides. So just very briefly, where I am now, I'm Director of Open Science at Hindawi. Hindawi was bought at the beginning of this year by Wiley. Hindawi is a fully open access publisher, and we publish more than 20,000 peer-reviewed articles a year in over 200 journals, and we're a founding member of OASPA. But what I really want to talk about is open science, and this is the 2016 Amsterdam Call for Action. And essentially, open science, the whole rationale for it is that it will bring huge benefits for science itself, as well as for its connection with society. And that was in 2016. This year, we had the most fantastic statement from UNESCO about open science, which I think is about to be ratified in the next month. But they extended, in a way, the pillars of open science. It's been much more elaborated by many different stakeholders. And that includes open access to outputs, including research data, software and source code, but also hardware and open science infrastructure, as well as a whole wealth of ways to start to be more accountable and engage with society. And we know now there is increasing evidence just about the value of data, so the economic benefit of the human genome has been well researched, but there are also increasing accounts that it helps to increase trust. We have an amazing example during the pandemic, and I'll speak to that a little bit later, about both the benefits, the pros and cons of different things. But one of the things I just want to stress here is that we have 17 sustainable development goals to get through. And while the focus has been on biomedicine and STEM and health, every single one of those sustainable development goals deserves the same access to research, the same discovery, the same sort of collaboration as we've seen in COVID. And so many stakeholders think this is somehow applies to STEM. What I want to keep as a memory in the talk is that this applies to every single subject, all the humanities, arts and social sciences as well. So open access, are we at a tipping point? I'm not going to go through, but there's been loads of different initiatives. These are just very, very few. It looks as though we're getting there. Whether we go the green or gold route, that's still a matter of contention. But things are happening, but we're still only about 25% open access. But we know that open access to publications is just the tip of the scholarly iceberg. And underneath that is the much larger challenges we have. And it's about the health of the entire system. And COVID provides us with a sort of snapshot. It showcases both the power of open access and open data, and it exposes fundamental systemic flaws in the existing system. And so, you know, all of this, scientists started sharing data. It made an amazing difference, the collaboration, the international collaboration around data. By the end of the year, there wasn't just one vaccine available, there were 5 vaccines. That is remarkable. The response from organizations like the Wellcome Trust was to try and gather momentum right at the beginning of the pandemic and make all research about relevant to COVID available by asking all journals and publications to be freely available, to have preprints, to have data deposited with them. And this was the one on the right here is from the New England Journal of Medicine. There was various studies and analyses done. This was done in July in 2020. And at that stage, they were seeing notable scholarly publishers making articles available instantly via open access and to ensure all researchers have access to published material. And I'm not going to dwell so much about open access per se, but the point I want to make here is very well phrased by Vincent Lariviere, who's at Montreal, which is basically they're saying we're opening up everything because it's important that we advance things fast. Well, the flip side of this argument is that our normal behavior is to put barriers to science. So our normal behavior is to slow progress for all those other sustainable development goals, but also for blue sky thinking. And then there are problems, and we know it's not just problems around preprints and people were worried about this, but huge major retraction based on fabricated data, which raises huge questions about what the role of peer review is in the system now. And this, this was the Lancet. It's one of the highest ranking, most expensive journals that you can make your article open access in. And what is peer review doing if it allows an article through this? And it's not to pick an Elsevier, because there are loads and there's lots of subject areas where you could dig and find this. So openness, what's stopping us? And this is a slide I did a while ago, but it's essentially the cultural change is the huge problem. So if you think of open science very simplistically as any open output and all open infrastructure, then no matter how much technical advance we have in making outputs open, in making that infrastructure available and interoperable, if we don't have cultural change, we don't achieve anything. And I still think we are, the cultural change side of things is a thing that's slowing progress most. And of course, we know incentives drive culture and create inequity. And the biggest barriers to open science are the perverse incentives of the reward and evaluation system, particularly those around journals. And we've seen all sorts of bizarre behavior, including financial bonuses, but for publications and in high impact journals, but a complete lack of reward for data, for citing data, for other outputs, for research integrity practice. There's no encouragement for any researcher to publish negative, null or inconclusive results. Why would they, let alone share the data associated with them? And this is causing huge and fundamental bias in the scientific literature. And it's only been looked at in a few subject areas. But that's because, and people say there isn't a reproducibility crisis, but that's because it hasn't been looked for, I think, in other disciplines. This is just a really horrible example. It was 2 years ago. It's from a European university, how they measure the absolute worth of a researcher using an equation that involves the impact factor. I mean, it is just bizarre. This was a health research performing organization. So we know top-down policy drives behavior. If you evaluate and reward researchers based on where they publish, you get in a few entrenched venues. If you evaluate them on the quantity of papers, you just get lots of salami slicing and short papers without full stories. On the other hand, if you have open access mandates, you get more open access. If you have a data availability statements, you get more data sharing. And if you have data management plans, you get better data stewardship. So we know that top-down policy drives behavior. It's not the solution. And of course, this is just another paper. There's lots of articles out there. Why aren't you sharing your data? When researchers are asked this, well, their immediate response is, I need to publish first, and that's the majority. This was a survey done by the European Universities Association, asking about different activities that researchers valued, and publications come out top, and open science and open access comes out bottom. And that was in 2019. This is just a snapshot. It's 2019, but this is what always strikes me, is that even where it's completely obvious that data should be shared, clinical trials, and often these are clinicians and doctors who are researchers, and they're not willing to share their data. I mean, how come we're here? And it's 2019, and we know this. But not only that, the entire culture embeds the financial system and the publishing industry because it's based around few publication. Journals gain financially as soon as you're indexed by Web of Science, have an impact factor, your bottom line goes up. You get loads of submitting authors, and the journals gain massively. Institutions gain financially, their rankings go up, and researchers are essentially trapped in this system. Now, there are lots of initiatives to try and stop this, about responsible metrics and others. But we know that fundamentally, this is one of the main messages of my talk. I'm just going to look at my stopwatch because it's is that we cannot change culture with point interventions by one funder here, one institution there, one publisher there. It has to be solved through collective action and policy alignment. And this is essentially the view of Dora. I'm wearing a Dora hat in this slide. But there are also fundamental opportunities which we're just missing. And these are opportunities for industry and for business, as well as for science and society. We have the opportunity to actually fundamentally shift the business relationships between publishers and the research community from a model based on ownership, control, and journal brands to one based on services, collaboration, and community engagement. We have an amazing technical opportunity to really create a truly open, reusable, and interoperable infrastructure. And we have the opportunity to change that culture and focus and reward the practice and process of science as much as individual outputs or individuals themselves, and also to try and start to reward teams. I mean, there's a whole, you know this stuff, so I'm really just, I'm not going to go on at length. But what makes open science transformative? So we have open access, we're getting there. There's been mandates about open access to publications. And I think it is actually, oops, how do I go back? The infrastructure. Sorry, okay, we'll go back, I think. And I have purposely done a train here and Matt at DataSite once likened infrastructure to a train and what goes on the system. And most people aren't aware of the tracks and everything else that goes on it. For a researcher, what they're doing in today's system is they're getting on a steam train, which is enormously prestigious. It's very luxurious. It's absolutely fantastic. And they don't realize that the train's just sitting there and the tracks are going nowhere, because the infrastructure to support the delivery, discovery, and access to that information just isn't there, or not in the way it should be. I'm not going to tell you what PIDs and metadata are, but I wanted to stress this is actually an extract from about sharing data in the humanities. And my point here is that it's really, we live in a bubble around PIDs and metadata. Most researchers have no idea what that means. They don't know what a PID is, they don't know what a metadata is until you start to explain it in their languages like accession numbers or whatever. But there's a real educational gap between us at this type of meeting and the researchers on the ground who have just no idea. They know about open access, but they don't know about the infrastructure. And this goes back to, well, Paul Peters was the CEO of Hindawi, and he wrote, and I'll show you later, but essentially that open scholarly communications infrastructure should be built on and contribute back to openly available data sets. And this is particularly important for metadata about the research process itself. It's about research on research. And this builds on what Jeff Bilder and Jennifer Lynn and Cameron wrote in 2015, which are now the basis of the POSI principles, that data about the research process itself deserves exactly the same level of respect and care. And we know there are these missing links. So we know there's a problem with culture. We know there's a problem with infrastructure. We know there's a problem about proprietary metadata. And the missing link for in the sort of data circle is, you know, if you're a researcher, you have an article draft, you might send it as a preprint, you'll send it off to a publisher, the publisher will publish the article. But what's missing is, even though there are the processes available for this, are data citation and article data linking. And not only that, within data citation, you have got publishers stripping out data citations where they happen. And this all comes back fundamentally to not the technology, we've got the technology to do this, but to the reward system. And again, even though it's been shown by Ian and others that you can increase the number of citations you get if you have a data availability statement, that's not shifting the needle for researchers enough. Very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a blog post that I wrote with Ginny Hendricks and Ludo and others that came out during Open Access Week. And this is about the closure of Microsoft Academic Graph, which was actually supplying a lot of metadata, which was being used to try and track and trace research objects and data and papers. It's mostly about papers, but it's going to apply just as much to data, if not more. And basically, Microsoft Academic is a commercial company, but they made their metadata freely available. They actually had a whole lot more stuff than Crossref, and it was more complete. It doesn't have quite, Crossref has additional data, but it also had unique data from full text of articles through deals that Microsoft made with publishers, that then the publishers allowed the free text to be made available for mining. Whereas the open infrastructures such as OpenAir didn't have this privilege at all. So you've got a commercial company making deals with publishers, so you can mine the literature, but you can't do this with an open infrastructure, which is bizarre. And there are lots of lessons that we can learn about this, and is that one of the things is we need to start to organize the metadata in the infrastructure according to common principles around open infrastructure. We need to collaborate, and we need to develop policies that require openness of all metadata associated with all scholarly publications. And this is where this working group looking at funder publishing policy alignment is really important. The other thing not to forget is that metadata is always going to be incomplete. Metadata about data or about papers or how papers connect to data, we will always need open access to the full text. So where are we as scholarly publishers accountable? Where do we sit? What role and responsibilities do we have in contributing to open science and supporting those who contribute or pay for our services? And I'm going to take a brief 1 minute meander into this a group of collaborating publishers who set up this COVID rapid review initiative. And this is something that I worked with Susanna and FAIRsharing on, and I'd like to also thank Susanna because she helped make these slides for another webinar. But the objectives of this group of publishers and FAIRsharing and a preprint server was to basically try and speed up the review time and transfer of manuscript if they got rejected of COVID articles, but also to ensure that the manuscripts had the data associated. And this was motivated by the Wellcome Trust statement. And so you couldn't join the group unless you had a data availability statement. And the idea was to try and support FAIR principles. You know about FAIRsharing, but FAIRsharing themselves created a dedicated page, which you can see here, of the publishers in the initiative and all the standards that they linked out to. The hugely important thing about FAIRsharing is it provides an opportunity for publishers to register their policy so others can actually find out what publishers are doing. And that's one of the hardest things for researchers as well, is to know whose data policy is where and what it means for them as a researcher submitting a policy. So I think alignment around policy registration is incredibly important. We achieved a little, there's a big report coming out about this, but we did get additional publishers registering their policies. Hindawi, which had a data availability statement, but available on request option for authors, we upped that to mandate it for COVID, and that's still an ongoing process. We did some things, but that's obviously just a very very small amount that publishers can be doing. What we do need is we know that we need to have more data about data sharing, and we need much more work to harmonize data policies across publishers and with funders. And that's what this group that I'm speaking with today is about. So what is the role and responsibility of publishers? Well, I think the infrastructure that enables access, reuse, and discovery of scholarly knowledge, whether it's outputs or data, is as important for discovery. This is what's under that iceberg. Our role is not to be a gatekeeper, but a facilitator and service provider. And I don't think it matters whether you're commercial or not for profit, because there is bad practice on every single side where you look. But we do have to look at the infrastructure and open access and ask the question whether we're being held up by the commercial interests of one or two large actors who want to ensure that content, infrastructure, and metadata is proprietary. And is this really acceptable when we could be service providers, when it's at the expense, ultimately, of science and society? And ultimately, can publishers be as open and collaborative as we are asking researchers to be about their data and information? And this is a sort of more evidence-informed approach, which I would like to take. And this goes back to one of the reasons I went to Hindawi from PLOS in 2017. This is the CEO who basically says you can have a company. Everything can be open source. You can have open data and open metadata, open integrations, and even open contracts. And that's where I think there is an opportunity. And I don't like the polarization between commercial and non-commercial players, because it's actually about what are the services that we need to serve the academy. And this is taken, it wasn't a figure in the Microsoft Academic Graph blog, but I basically put it in a figure because it captures, I think, what is policy alignment about. And policy alignment does need some funder mandates. Where would we be without open access if some funders hadn't mandated open access? That's a very sharp top-down tool, because ultimately, and that's a political tool, the real change will come with cultural change when institutions and academic libraries and researchers follow with their feet and implement policies, both in their institutions and around their own research and departments. And those, and the example here is with open metadata and how that policy might align between funders, researchers, institutions, and researchers. And those are the drivers that are going to change the service providers. And if you see publishers as service providers, then the very basic thing that publishers should be doing is making complete metadata available for all our works, that's data and publications, suitable in an open infrastructure. And the rest of that follows. And so policy alignment
Katrina, sorry to interrupt,
Great.
gonna have to hurry up.
Okay, great, thanks. So essentially, my point is systemic change cannot happen without policy alignment. We need both top-down and bottom-up approaches. And I'm going to leave you with this last quote from Mariana Mazzucato, who's been helping drive the sort of economic policy and green agenda in Europe. If the collective process of innovation is not properly recognized, the result will be a narrow group of private corporations and investors reaping the full returns of projects which the state has helped to initiate and finance. I do not mean we need to nationalize the publishing industry, but we need to align all the political commitments and the policies if any change is to happen at all. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Ian.
Well, thank you so much, Katrina. Fascinating presentation. As I noted at the beginning of the session, we'll be holding off on questions to the very end, seeing as the agenda is so packed, and I have no confidence in my abilities as a chair to kind of contain the discussion within such a short time as we'd have to keep it and able to move on to the next presenters. But the next presenter is Madison, who will be talking to us about kind of like the researcher perspective on policy alignment between funders and publishers. As she's pulling up her slides, I'll just go over her bio. So Ralitza Madison is currently a Sir Henry Wellcome postdoctoral fellow at UCL Cancer Institute, researching the role of class IAP I3K signaling and health and disease. Apologies if I got that wrong. She previously did a PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she also got increasingly engaged with the emerging open science movement in the UK. She has since participated in promoting research integrity and reproducibility nationally as well as internationally. In 2019, she wrote a FEBS commentary giving her perspective on key issues with current research culture and potential solutions based on the tenets of open science. She is currently a member of the UK Reproducibility Network, UKRN, and was one of the 2 authors of a recent universal funders policy supported by the network. In her role as an open science supporter, she advocates for a better research culture on the back of an overhaul of current research assessment metrics, which are mainly focused on quantity over quality. So with that, please take it away, Brilitza.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was a long read of that bio. I should have just sent a couple of sentences instead of that whole blurb. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm basically a systems biologist, and I'm emphasizing that because Catriona just said that systems problems require systems solution, and I'm quite pleased that she said that. I actually had it on one of my slides, but I removed it subsequently. So I really think that hits spot on. And as Jeremy has just mentioned, I'm quite familiar with the topic of open science and have been quite heavily involved in advocating for open research data, the position, including this policy template, which I actually won't really be focusing on today, but I've put it up here to basically emphasize that although I'm going to give you the researcher's perspective on open research data, I'm probably not the average researcher in the sense in when it comes to awareness of this topic. And a key message of mine today is that the average researcher is sadly rather disengaged from this topic. And the reason for that lies in what Catriona has already covered really nicely, the culture, the broken culture that I currently am part of as well. So I think before going into aspects of open research data and some of the opportunities and challenges that I see as a researcher, it's important to once again have a look at the whole system, the whole research system in its entirety, the different cogs that need to be working together for this system to work in an optimal fashion. And of course, we've got the various stakeholders and the various activities that I, as a researcher, am part of. And it's important to always ask the question when we discuss various policies and initiatives, are they going to have the impact that we want them to have, and what is the impact that we want them to have? So how will changing how will change of the movement of one of these little cogwheels here impact the movement or the workings of the remaining wheels? And as a systems biologist, that's actually one of the questions that I'm asking in my daily research. How will changing the function of protein A affect not just protein A, but the entire system? And will it actually have the benefits that I want it to have? Now, most of my research activities, or the activities of the researchers around me, are actually determined by what is needed for me to get my funding. What's needed for me to get funding? Well, publications, and then we can discuss what kind of publications are needed, and we come back to this cultural problem that Catriona also covered. And I think in the current, I think actually open research data, or mandating open research data, is a potentially really powerful solution to some of the problems that currently cause this system to work work the wrong way. Now, again, this is not just a personal view, just because I'm an advocate of open science and I believe in the importance of open research data. Even researchers who are rather disengaged from the open science agenda generally of the view that the current system doesn't reward rigor, it doesn't reward really carefully done science. It rewards impactful research, with impactful here basically meaning equal to impact, high impact factor. So researchers generally feel that they're judged on their lack of impactful findings as opposed to their ability to perform excellent research. And this is taken from the 2020 report by the Wellcome Trust covering what researchers think about the culture that they work in. And broadly speaking, you can divide researchers into two types, and one type prevails in the current system. So I will, for simplicity, just call them researcher type A, and as you'll see in a second, researcher type B. Researcher type A is the type of researcher that is actually rather common, and sadly so. This is the type of researcher who is more concerned with being first at the expense of potentially being wrong. So this type of researcher encourages sloppy research conduct. I'll give you some example in a second, including selective data reporting. So most recently, I heard a senior researcher say, well, better not do the experiment that we worry will show us stuff that we don't want to see, because, you know, that's going to go against us when we submit our work back to the journal. So it may be better for science, but it's not good for us. So this is just one example, and it's one of many. And when someone like me finds it particularly frustrating because of my involvement in this area, when I raise this as a shocking statement to some of my colleagues who are perfectly good researchers, they say, well, why are you upset about this? They're all like this. So it's a general prevailing view that this type of research is rather common, and it's the type of research that gives you the so-called impactful publications potentially, and those obviously are what benefit your scientific career. Now, this is also the type of research that is driving irreproducibility, and I won't go into details of what irreproducibility really means in this context, but I would still argue that irreproducibility, even for this type of researcher, is damaging to their career. But as I'll come back to later, the consequences do not materialize immediately. Now, researcher type B is the opposite of researcher type A. This is someone who is quite rigorous, who engages in transparent data reporting, and who, most importantly, especially when it comes to biomedical science, is very open about the limitations of their own research. I say this, and I emphasize it in particular because I, for instance, communicate directly with some of the patients who are affected or who could potentially benefit from the type of research I'm doing, and I see the damage that can be done when researchers hype their own findings. Now, this type of researcher will also produce impactful publications, potentially more so than researcher type A, and the benefit will also be that these publications or the data in these publications are more likely to be reproducible. And this is, of course, beneficial for the scientific career of researcher type B. So why is researcher type A prevailing? Well, in the current system, at least. Well, the reason for that is differences in the kinetics. So again, I'm actually taking inspiration from my own research, where we tend to have these diagrams about positive feedback loops and interactions between proteins and cellular components. So I've basically just replaced those components with bits that are relevant to research culture, and the key point here is that researcher type A gets to this benefit faster than researcher type B, because by doing that, by engaging in this type of questionable research practice, if you like, you're more likely to get those clean stories that are particularly sought after by some of the bigger publishers. At least that is the view of the researchers on the ground floor. And although the work may be irreproducible, this only appears or comes out later if it comes out if it even comes out at all, because showing that someone's work is irreproducible requires that you try to actually repeat it and that you are able to publish those negative findings somewhere. And that, again, is quite difficult, because negative findings don't make for a good story. So researcher type B, on the other hand, is quite slow because it takes time to curate your data, to do all the necessary control experiments, and also to be open about them and get them past the editor. I say this from personal experience as well. And again, I'm saying this not as someone who has failed in science. I'm doing relatively well in science, but that comes at the cost of having to work extra hard to find the time to do this type of research and be able to compete with researcher type A. So funders and publishers, in my opinion, must align their policies in order to limit and not strengthen researcher type A. And even though many funders and publishers actually have open research policies available already, one of the issues is that those policies are not being enforced. So they're not mandatory. I see it not only as someone who submits papers for publication, but also as someone who reviews papers, nowhere in my reviewer guidelines does it actually give me a detailed list of things to check with regards to the availability of data, even though a journal may claim that they have rather stringent data deposition policies. And that is one of the main obstacles, because as Catriona also highlighted, researchers, the conduct of researchers is ultimately driven by the incentives. And if you're not being rewarded for being rigorous, or if you're not being sanctioned or punished, if you like, for being sloppy, well, you will end up with the system where researcher type A prevails over researcher type B. So the negatives, I've already more or less covered them, but one key issue is that we lose talent due to dissatisfaction with research culture and corner cutting, because rigor isn't rewarded. And as we saw, there is this positive feedback loop where bad science actually ends up breeding more bad science. There's even mathematical modeling done on this and showing that that is the case. So why are researchers disengaging from all these policy discussions and generally the open science movement? Well, partly because they don't see it as something that will help them progress in their career. It's just another time-consuming activity, and it's not mandatory, nor is it being enforced. So it becomes very difficult for someone who actually tries to comply with open science principles to function in this system, partly because you lack, I for instance lack the senior support that is needed to try and make this common practice. Even if institutions pledge their support to initiatives such as DORA or open science deposition, open data deposition. So I've been in Cambridge, now I'm at UCL, and I've been in Edinburgh as well, and they all have various policies at the top level. And yet when you ask researchers on the ground floor, do you know about DORA? In our most recent away day, 80% of researchers didn't know what DORA is. And you can go on the UCL website and you'll see that they pledge support for DORA, but there is a fundamental block, if you like, in education and communication, partly because there's no incentive to engage with these initiatives as they currently stand. There is also this general perception that the current policy landscape is a minefield, and I have some sympathy with this. There is, as a researcher, especially in the biomedical sciences, I've sometimes been frustrated with what appears to be a lack of pragmatism and lack of discipline-specific considerations when some of these policies are being developed, particularly with respect to open research data. And one of my key messages as well to those of you who are working on policy alignment and will continue to do that is that one size may not fit all, and it's really important to actually engage with the researchers and ask them what will be really useful for you in terms of deposited data and what is really the minimum necessary for you to be able to reproduce a particular experiment. Now, the reason I say lack of pragmatism is because some data sets, we all generate data as researchers, and different disciplines generate different types of data sets. And I know we talk a lot about indexing and metadata and PIDs, etc. And as Catriona said, most researchers don't even know what it is. And perhaps we need to ask the question, do we need the best solution? Will it ever arrive? Will the second best solution be too slow? And should we just try and start with the third best solution and have something rather than nothing? So what I mean here is get researchers to deposit their data.
Sorry to interrupt.
I'm running out of time?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know what, I'll skip this. My whole point here was that we're now forced to deposit data sets that are not necessarily machine readable and not particularly useful because they're in a long supplementary file. And yet the fact that we have to deposit these forces researchers to actually perform those extra checks on their data because they know that potential errors can actually be found. And that slows research, that slows you down, but it also makes for more rigorous research. And what we need now is for publishers and funders to enforce this for all the other low throughput data that researchers generate, not just big data sets like sequencing data, etc. So sorry, ran out of time, but I'll end up here with my open research data wish list. So open access with open data, align data policies, at least across funders, monitor and enforce those policies and sanction non-compliance, and standardize open data guidelines, not just for researchers, but also for reviewers, and make data deposition easy, reliable, equitable, and pragmatic, and educate. So that's one big point that I also want to emphasize, to make sure that you engage the researchers on the ground floor. And I think I'll leave it here. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Litz. Excellent. I think that's a great wish list. I'm going to be really interested to return to that and see how at least what we're doing as a funder might be working into that. And then, of course, looking at that in light of what we're planning as part of this project. So at this point, we'll move on to Miles, and I will pull up his presentation on my screen, and just he can let me know when he wants me to advance it. So Milesaxton is a publisher at Wiley and editor-in-chief of the new open research journal, Advanced Genetics. He was the chief editor of Nature Genetics for 15 years. Before that, he was a university lecturer in molecular and cellular biology at the University of Oxford. He obtained his degree in genetics at Cambridge in 1985 and his doctorate at Imperial College in 1990. And between 1990 and 1995, did postdoctoral research at Dundee and at MIT's Whitehead Institute. Miles' research made use of the advanced genetics of Drosophila to study genome stability by examining the roles of cell cycle regulators in life cycle transitions. His interest broadened into human genetics, genomics, and systems biology through lecturing and from tutoring biochemists, zoologists, and medical students from primary research papers, helping to establish Oxford's innovative research masters in science and integrative biosciences led Miles to realize the importance of the integrative overview of biomedical research. As a full-time professional editor, he is now in a position to use this perspective to help coordinate research in genetics. So Miles, just let me know when I should advance this, and I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. Can you share the full screen and put it to the second slide, please?
Okay. Let's see. Hang on a second. I'm not quite sure how to put this to full screen, Miles.
Okay, just go to the second slide then. That would be great.
Okay.
So I'm going to talk about the publisher perspective, remembering that I'm really an editor and a scientist. So I can't speak for the publishers, but we have opportunities, right? We need incentives, and there are some disincentives from the publisher perspective. This is the era of funder agreements. So we have publish and read agreements with a large number of countries where the authors can avail themselves of any open access journal right across the publisher, and everybody can then read the open access results of that. This gives the funder an enormous bargaining tool if they want to mandate services from the publisher. We need to make sure in all these agreements that the publishers are professional and that they really earn the APC income that they get for open access publishing. So I've made a list of things here which I believe we're going to miss the future as publishers if we don't pay attention to these important points. But I must say, I've not heard any of these items as being a high priority for a commercial publisher. So we have to think, what is in it for the publisher to engage with open research rather than just to do open access publishing and talk about open research? I believe that publishers get into the business out of a sense of services that we provide to authors and readers. So the opportunity to publish more and better articles through data reuse should be an obvious aspiration as we compete with other publishers. And we also have binding agreements like Crossref across publishers, which help to drive the interoperability and the value of the publishing houses together for all authors and all readers. So innovation is inevitably going to happen in the form and content of research, given that we have digital object-based technologies, unique persistent identifiers, ontologies, and high-speed computer networks. So being a journal of record should still be an aspiration for all publishers. We should want to be the place where attribution happens, not at the Crossref level, not at the Clarivate journal impact factor level, not in the indexing of scholarly publications by national archives like the PubMed indexing system. But these, to researchers, are what they live and die by. The metrics from the third-party measurement of the performance of the publishers. The publishers have lost the agenda in terms of giving credit. And the number of cases in which articles are published without the author contribution statement and without the actual grant numbers that are required by the funder shows that the level of attention of detail of publishers and authors to metadata, essential metadata. Who are you? Why did you write this? Who paid for it? And what is it about? These things get lost in the rush to get these surrogate measures from PubMed, from Clarivate, and so on for advancement. So I think what we need to do is have a publisher commitment not to publish less information than the authors want published, and to provide services rather than simply take an APC and say, well, there's the service, there's an open access article, you have it licensed and you can do what you want with it. Next slide, please. Okay, so Wiley, there are about 1,600 journals, and different fields have different types of data, and they have different practices, and many titles are owned by scholarly societies that have entrenched practices and long and illustrious records. So if a publisher wants to implement something across 1,600 journals, it has to be generally acceptable to everyone, and it has to be aspirational, and it must be clear that it is moving towards greater transparency. And so we're quite happy that we've managed to achieve an expectation of data sharing. We have a menu of 8 types of data availability statement, and most journals recognize that where data is deposited in a purpose-built repository for the community that reads that type of paper, there should be a suitable permanent link that is provided by the repository and is linked in 2 directions from the journal article back and forth to that repository, and it actually resolves to properly formatted and reusable data that that community would require. And most of the journals that then require shared data usually have some checking process that may be editorial, it may be at the publisher level, and it may also involve the use of peer review. Now, the ideal, of course, for data sets is that the data be seen for reusability by data experts, and the science that rides on top of that data should be peer reviewed by peers who are actually going to use the scientific conclusions and the data and materials that are presented and discussed in that paper. So this is just an indication of the services that the publisher should be providing at this stage. Obviously, a menu of generally agreed data availability statements that are comparable across publishers, that journal publishers should provide data journals for the communities that are data intensive and require peer review of data articles. And I'll point out why you'd want to do that separate from the scientific article, not only in terms of time, but in terms of expertise, utility, and a failure of one-to-one correspondence between a publication and a data set. I believe one data set can give rise to tens of thousands of publications. So I think it's essential that data be considered in its own right. and the recommendations for permalinked repositories and two-way linking. Obviously, that's a matter for community standards. So now I'm going to give you two long-running experiments, which are vignettes into what an editor can do to advance open research. So next slide, please. This editorial was written in 2014 after I published a position paper from Dina Paltu about dbGaP, and then went back over how well my journal Nature Genetics had been performing with respect to a particular type of article in the field of genetic epidemiology. So I found 66 articles over a period from 2008 to 13, which is approximately when that type of article was popular. And these are highly cited. So that led me to a hypothesis. Does dbGaP accession code or deposition of the data in a publicly mandated and publicly funded repository that's generally accessible to at least the US research community increase the citation and use of the research article? Luckily, I was in a data-rich journal and I was able to identify 13 pairs of articles which deal with the same experimental design, the same trait. They're published on the same day in the same journal by different groups, and they're discordant with respect to whether they contain a deposited dbGaP accession. So in each case, there's a pair of articles, one of which has a dbGaP deposited data set, and another which does not deposit its data in dbGaP. In fact, there's no accession to that data set. You have to go and ask the authors for it. So when I published this article, I found that there was an insignificant difference in the citation to this particular set of 13 articles. I didn't give up, and I had a look at it recently. And after 10 years, which is a mean between 2008 till now to 2013 till now, that data set now has a significant difference in favor of dbGaP articles. It's 24% more citations if you have a dbGaP accession, and even the median is 16% higher than the median of the 13 articles that were without a dbGaP accession. So finally, after 10 years, well outside the impact factor window, we have evidence of greater utility for publicly accessible data. Now, whether that comes from the authors writing a cleaner and better paper, or whether people are finding the data, using it and reusing it in their own work, remains to be examined by an expert. But as an editor, I found this gratifying, and I think that this is a cogent argument that can be brought to the publishers, along with Ian's argument that the data availability statement adds to the citability of the paper. As long as you're going for high impact journals, you're not going to see any added value. But as long as the citation to the paper and the contribution of the paper to the impact of the journal, then we are on good grounds, rational grounds, for saying that making data available makes it more useful. Next slide, please.
1 minute if you can, Miles, please.
Yep. This is just what happens if you don't assemble your genomes. These 616 pneumococcus lines, you could take the data out of SRA in the original Nature Genetics paper, but it would take you 2 weeks to assemble the genomes, and then you wouldn't know if they were assembled the same way as the authors did for the original paper. So with a SciData paper that explains and does the extra 20% work to assemble and make accessible all the assemblies, there is a little extra citation to the data paper, but it looks as though the peak citations to the original Nature Genetics paper also goes up in the same year, 2017. So final slide. Yeah, final slide shows there's very good alignment between the NIH supported repository map in FAIRsharing at the left and the SciData, Nature's dedicated data journal in terms of which repositories are supported for which purposes. In addition, the data journal supports the standards as well that underlie the repository. And there's my journal on the right at Wiley, Advanced Genetics. And again, that's a subset of the data using community that happens to use genetic and genomic data. And again, it looks very similar to that mandated by the funder. So I would say the take home from this is that journals need to support as well as supporting the databases that implement vocabularies, schemata, and standards. But I believe the journals could go further to support the standards themselves if they could keep up with the proliferation of standards that the authors keep publishing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Miles. It's so interesting. I was actually scheduled to present next from a funder's perspective. We're running quite short on time, so I think I might skip that, just so we have enough time for discussion and so on, and pass it over to Joris, who is going to be speaking to us about some research that the STM Association conducted on funder policies, which I think he'll probably speak to a few things that I was planning to anyway. So with that, I'll pass it over to him. But just by way of introduction, Joris has been STM's Director of Research Integrity since January 2021. In this role, he supports and coordinates STM's research integrity and data programs, which are integral components of STM's mission to advance trusted research. Joris has worked for several leading companies and organizations across the STM publishing space, including Digital Science and Elsevier, where he initiated and led a variety of important innovations and cross-publisher initiatives within the research and publishing ecosystem. Joris holds a master's degree in biology and a PhD in philosophy. Did you want to present your slides, Joris? Or
yes,
okay.
Please. Yes, and also here, apologies for the long introduction. I should have also.
Okay.
Yeah, shall I share my screen?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe give a bit of background for why I'm here presenting this. So STM started the research data year. I actually presented on that program in the previous plenary session. But basically, we started a project supporting publishers and rolling out a variety of things to share and link and cite research data among publications. So in the program, we support publishers rolling out data policies, data availability statements, and SCOLEX was our focus. At the same time, we realized that alignment is very important. And we heard the presentations earlier today in this session. As a proof of that, we have to align the policies among the publishers, but also especially between the funders and the policies. So I'm happy to participate in this project. But I'm going to be very practical today because what we commissioned at STM is a bit of more research in the level of overlap between the data policies of the publishers and the funders. And we use the framework from the RDA interest group to the right, so describing very policy levels according to the elements, and basically seeing to what extent do the policies of the funders comply to these or make use of the same elements, and to what extent their actual policies overlap. Now, the research we've done, which is openly available, it's on Zenodo, and I think Ian was going to share the link as well, but I can also do that in the chat afterwards. And basically, this is the publishing moment of the research. So I encourage you to check it out. And of course, we hope that this is going to be useful in the further work of this project. So in today's presentation, I first of all invite you to check out the data, but I also going to give you a high-level overview of the results. So what we did is we selected the top 100 funders, and we did it on basis on the number of publications from Crossref. And a check was done whether data policies could be found on the websites of these funders. So we found 26 funders out of 100 again, based on the number of publications that had a data policy that we could find. And I stress here we could find, because it might be that, you know, it was simply, it does exist, and the researchers that got funded are aware of its existence, but we simply couldn't find it. So it's basically a desk research we did. So out of the 26 data policies we could find of those top 100 funders, most came out of the EU, or Europe, I should say, 7 from the EU countries, individual countries, UK, US, Australia 2, European level 2, and then 1 in Canada, 1 in China, and 1 in Japan. But also one of the action points I think will be, let's delve a bit more into countries that are underrepresented in this research and determine whether it's really a lack of policy or simply us unable to find it. So again, we analyze this policy according to the several characteristics that came out of the framework from the RDA interest group. And basically we checked all these funder data policies on these elements. And don't worry, I'm not going to read them out all, but I'm going to just mention the most important ones. So the most important observation. So the question, does the policy mention data repositories? Yes, most of the 26 data policies from funders did make explicit references to repositories, but more on a high level. So it described the features, but it's not that specific repositories are recommended. Then we looked at whether the policy, the funder policy, mentioned data citation, and most of them do not refer to, you know, data citation. And then it's interesting is, does the policy require a data management plan? Yes, that is clearly a core element of the funder policy. So 76% of those funder policies did mention DMPs and require them, made them mandatory. Then it's interesting is Jeremy mentioned the approach of the project before, and we talked about 3 elements where we could potentially look for alignment. One was the data management plan. Well, that is obviously something that was mentioned. The other one is data availability statements. And of course, data availability statements are interesting because potentially you could use these, or the funder could use these, to see whether the policy was actually followed and adhered to. But interestingly enough, data availability statements are not hardly mentioned in the funder. So only 1 funder mentioned availability statements. And again, this is striking because it is a core element of the journal data policies. And in the research data program from STM, we very much focus on rolling these out. So interesting observation, something we can work on. Also interesting, does the policy mention FAIR data? And well, the majority of the funders do not mention the word FAIR. I think there's also, of course, a clear difference between the mentioning or the awareness of FAIR in Europe and the US. So also among funders, FAIR in the entire documentation about the policies is not mentioned that frequently. And then another observation, does the policy mention researcher author support? So where can they go to? Is there any maybe financial support or organizational support for helping them to share the data? Well, actually, most do not, and less frequently than in the case of publishers. And if they do mention support, it's mostly in terms of frequently asked questions or referring to other web resources. Now, another important one is compliance with the policy monitored, and that relates back to the question about the availability statement. And I also found this interesting that 23% said yes. So in some way there is the compliance to the data policy is monitored, but the majority do not at all. Again, I think also an interesting opportunity or an interesting observation. Again, going back to the availability statement. So is there potentially something to think about alignment on the level of feedback loops or making sure that indeed policies are being followed, checked by, for example, the availability statements or journal policies. So that was it. And again, it's just the high level observation, but again, the main motivation for this is for the group and all others to look at it and be inspired by it and see where there's concrete action for further alignment.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joris. Excellent work on the part of the STM Association. I don't want to take any more time from the participants to ask questions and so on. So maybe we'll just move right into that. I don't know if Ian, I know you've been monitoring things. I don't know if you wanted to call on anybody who may have asked a question in the chat already, or if we should just open it up for people to raise hands.
People have been very good in chatting with their own questions, actually. I have been copy and pasting the chat because I think it's a useful record. So I would suggest pause for a couple of seconds to see if anyone has a burning question. Either they want to come off mic or they want to put it in the chat. Okay. Request to ask Phil Jones's last question about monitoring. I wonder what sort of monitoring is done. So can anyone speak to where there is compliance monitoring, what that looks like? So I think we're looking at one of the funding agencies in the room. So that's you, Jeremy, or if there's anyone else who wants to contribute.
Well, I can start. With respect to compliance monitoring, I mean, technologies there are evolving, I think, but certainly, as Joris suggested in his presentation, data availability statements are really key, at least for me and my team in monitoring compliance. What we found, it's really interesting trying to look into this and how it connects different types of open science policies. So for example, typically for us to do compliance monitoring using data availability statements, the paper often has to be open access. So that's kind of a link that you might not expect to other open science policies. But what we do find when monitoring for data availability statements in our work, we've typically found that about half of the journals or papers that we find include data availability statements. And even when they do, I mean, often researchers don't include the DOI. They'll say things like available upon request, or sometimes available within the paper and the supplementary materials, which is not ideal from our point of view. So that's one type of one way that that's really the key way right now that we monitor compliance with our data sharing policies, which have really only, it's really COVID where we've seen a big push within Canada and I think elsewhere to require data sharing. So the work that we've done on this has largely been in that context to see to what extent researchers in fact are sharing the data as they're required, but also trying to compare that with papers that were not produced from COVID funding and what are the differences there in terms of whether including a DOI in the availability statement or sharing data at all or including a DAS.
Do any of the other speakers want to comment on Jeremy's response or compliance monitoring in general? Katrina.
Hi, I think policy compliance is enormously difficult, and it's also a cultural problem because reviewers and editors are not trained to assess data or data availability statements. Ian can probably speak to this, but there's certainly, it was evidence at PLOS, I think, or at least anecdotal evidence, that just with a data availability statement being made available, it raises awareness among editors and reviewers. But actually, there's no training for it because that activity is not rewarded, just like peer review. And it comes back to that basic problem. I also think there's a way in which policy compliance doesn't have to be manual. It doesn't have to be checked, and I think this is where the metadata, however that is applied, is really important, because essentially, if you've got the right metadata, you've got high quality metadata and the associated PIDs, and of course there are all sorts of community standards, then you can basically check links to data from within the paper. This is just a start, but I actually think for some of these big papers, it's just not possible either to check compliance. I also know, I don't know if there's anyone from Springer Nature here, but Grace Baines talked about their policy where they went through and checked the data made available by every author in just one journal. And for some authors don't know what data to make available anyway. And hand-holding authors could take up, for one paper, could take up to 9 hours to get them to understand what was meant. So the lack of awareness, lack of education, lack of tools, it's just the system has never had any need to look at this, and it's only its dysfunction now that shows us the huge gaps. And compliance and monitoring is one of those issues, I think.
Thanks. Relitza, I see you responding with movement sometimes
Nodding.
to those comments. Yep. So it'd be great to get your perspective on that. And we also have another question for you, but I'll hold that until you give your response.
Yeah, no, I just saw the other question as well. No, I was basically just nodding because I completely agree with what was just being said in terms of the lack of education. And I think if you ask my average colleague what metadata is, they wouldn't know what metadata means. I actually had that experience 2 weeks ago because I asked someone to send me the metadata to do an analysis, and the person came back saying, "What is that?" So I had to explain that. And how can you ask them to comply or to provide data availability statements when they don't actually know the technicalities of it? So again, it all starts with education. And also going back to Catriana's statement in her presentation about researchers who, health care research, relevant publications where people don't want to share data. So why don't they want to share the data? And usually the reason, I think, is because people are worried that the mistakes will be found, or B, they can't actually find the data. That was one of the reasons for people not sharing data when they got a reasonable request to do so. And again, that's part of the culture. So the question, go back to what I meant by lack of discipline-specific considerations, putting researchers off open data. Well, one of the issues that I also experience myself sometimes is when you're faced with one of those big templates with tons of categories that you need to fill in terms of metadata, identifiers, etc. And you sometimes wonder, what is all that, and is all of that really needed, and people are actually not aware of what half of it actually means. So again, that puts people off because they consider it quite bureaucratic and they're not entirely sure what information they're supposed to provide. Discipline specific, that was the Western blotting example that I didn't quite have the chance to go through, but how that particular data set, image data set, a Western blot, putting it and copy pasting it into a supplementary, in a Word file, and then having 15 pages of a PDF where you just see this image. No one can use that. It's not reusable in any way whatsoever. It's still useful because it's a quality control check. It forces people to keep that raw data, not to edit it, because they know someone will end up looking at it, even if it's not usable. But you can make it more user-friendly by putting it into a repository, like putting the images in a repository. Why is it in a long supplementary file where no one can use it? But again, that's just an example of how, even if the system for data deposition isn't perfect, it still is useful to enforce some of these standards. So that was more sort of my point. Don't wait to make it really technically perfect and perhaps end up at the point where researchers disengage because they're not familiar with all of the technicalities. Start with maybe an imperfect solution and then improve it from there. That was mostly my point.
Thank you. I want to give Miles a chance to comment as one of the speakers, and just maybe remind that we have this theme of opportunities for policy alignment. But yeah, take it away, Miles, if you have anything to add before we have to run out of time.
Well, I think in the machine readability aspiration of fair data, publishers do use very standard manuscript tracking systems, and we already have pull down menus of major funders, and we have autofill for grant numbers and so on. We also have pull down menus for data availability statements. And if you've clicked on the one that says the data are shared under a DOI link, there is a space to put in the DOI links. So I think we already have the beginnings of something that's compliant, because if a funder wants to give us a list of grants, we can add that as a menu and fill that in for the authors. They can find their grant, they can find their data management plan, and then they can attach the data management plan and the database submissions in the appropriate place. So I think in the case where it is in the interest of the publisher, for example, if they have a data journal, they have a data-rich field, topic that is supported by a community, a repository, and a funder, it is relatively easy to configure the machines to make it, easy for the author, regardless of which journal they submit to be compliant. I'm more worried about the failure of all scientists to understand that when they have an Excel table, that the metadata to the data in that table are the row headings and the column headings, and the total failure to put one item in every cell of the table and one item in the row column heading and the row heading and the column heading. There's so many different levels of decoration that go onto the artifacts that are published as if they were data tables as supplementary data. They may be human readable, but you can never retrieve that data, and you very rarely can work out what the field entries are. You'd be much better off just generating a CSV from whatever machine originally spat out that data set and make it accessible in that format. Don't try to over decorate it, or you'll lose all the metadata and you'll make the data unusable. And throughout my career, I've been astonished by decorated Excel files, which are being used as if they were data. It really isn't helpful. We've had loads of workshops where people tried to verify those files, and it's nearly impossible. So I think if you're going to generate data for other people, you need to think about a management plan, and you need to think about who your consumers of data are before you publish.
Thanks. Jeremy, I think I better give it back to you as we're in the last 2 minutes. There is a question actually about whether funders and publishers get together in any other forum to talk about these problems. I'm not aware of anything specific, but I'm aware conversations do take place. But maybe that reinforces the fact that this is indeed the place to have these conversations. But Jeremy.
Yeah, so unfortunately we are just about at time. I wish we had some more time for a Q&A and for maybe charting directions on what we could do next as part of this group. I think we heard some really interesting things today, relating to items that we've discussed previously, namely data availability statements. But then some of the things that Miles and Katrina were saying about metadata, I think is increasingly very interesting. And it could be useful to think about how publishers and funders could work together on that front. And just by way of clarification, to my mind, when I think of policy alignment, it doesn't necessarily mean that funders and publishers have the same policies. It means that they're complementary. So, for example, on the data availability piece, I think it's really instructive that Joris, in your presentation, you talked about funders mentioning data availability statements. I think that typically funders feel that that's not something that they can really require because it's beyond their reach. But I do think it's certainly something that, as publishers work to, increasingly implement them in their journals, funders can do more to, raise awareness of them, or even, say things like, when sharing your data, do it within a data availability statement, kind of like a recommendation or an expectation, if not a strict requirement. Nevertheless, I think it is time to close the session. I welcome any concluding thoughts that any of our co-chairs might have. The folks that have helped me develop this session that are on the call right now are Joris, Susanna, Ian. There may be a couple others, Graham Smith, and so on. Before we do close the session, is there any final reflection any one of you wanted to make?
I would just encourage, if anyone has any cogent thoughts on that topic of opportunities for alignment, keep the conversation going on the Google Doc, on the mailing list, anywhere.
Okay. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all. Thanks so much to our speakers for coming into your talks. They were all just so fascinating and such a, provided some great input into what we could, where we could go with this project and the features that we could examine. And even what I'd like to do is actually really start thinking about what kind of recommendations we could develop, and hopefully provide, a bit of some discussion on those at the next RDA plenary. But I think we'll have to leave it there, and we'll see where this goes. So thank you so much for attending, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Happy to help.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.